That, she said, her voice a thin, reedy instrument of pure condescension, is an unacceptable fire hazard and a blight on this community's aesthetic. I followed the line of her expertly manicured finger, its blood-red nail jabbing at the air like a tiny, aggressive spear. It was pointing toward the winding, moss-lined path that led from the edge of my lawn down a gentle slope, under the shade of ancient oaks, to the old stone springhouse at the far end of my property. The path was an easement, clearly defined in my deed, and as much a part of the land as the granite bedrock it was carved from. "Brenda," I said, my voice deliberately calm, a counterpoint to the coiled tension in her posture. "That is a private access easement on my private property. It's been there for over a century. It leads to my springhouse." She made a sound, a little, of derision that was meant to convey how utterly unimpressed she was with my facts. Brenda, the self-appointed queen of the Estates at Whispering Creek Homeowners Association, stood on the very edge of my lawn, her feet planted just inches from the legal boundary, as if daring me to make an issue of it. She was a woman constructed of sharp angles and expensive, uncomfortable-looking fabrics. Her face was a mask of pleasant hostility, a smile plastered on that never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. "I don't care if it was carved by George Washington himself," she chirped, the smile tightening. "It's overgrown. It's undeveloped. The HOA covenants, Section 7, subsection B, paragraph 4, clearly state that all pathways visible from common areas must be paved, curbed, and maintained to community standards. Asphalt or approved paver stones. Your trail is a violation." I took a slow breath, the scent of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. It was the scent of the peace I had retired for. A peace that was currently being threatened by a petty tyrant in beige linen trousers. 2 points, Brenda. First, my property is not, nor has it ever been, part of the estates at Whispering Creek HOA. My deed predates your development by 60 years. We've been over this. Second, paving that easement is not only a terrible idea from an aesthetic and historical standpoint, but it would also create a non-permeable surface. The runoff would cause significant erosion down the slope and would likely contaminate the aquifer that feeds the spring. It's an ecologically catastrophic idea. I had spent 30 years as a colonel in the Army Corps of Engineers. I knew a little something about hydrology, soil stability, and the long-term consequences of ill-conceived construction projects. My rebuttal was based on decades of professional experience and immutable physical laws. She waved a dismissive hand, the bracelets on her wrist jangling irritably. "Don't try to baffle me with your technical jargon. The rules are the rules. You have 30 days to bring the pathway into compliance. If you fail to do so, we will levy a fine of $100 per day. If the fines remain unpaid, a lien will be placed on your property. And if necessary, we will hire a contractor to perform the work and bill you for the full amount. Is that clear?" The threat was delivered with the serene confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged. She believed in her power absolutely. In her small kingdom of manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, her word was law. I just looked at her. I didn't blink. I didn't argue further. I simply let her words hang in the quiet air between us. In her world, this was the end of the conversation. She had issued her decree. My compliance was the only possible outcome. What she couldn't see, what no one in this sleepy, suburban enclave could possibly guess, was the shift happening inside me. The anger I felt was a cold, clean thing, not a hot flash of temper. It was the quiet click of a tumbler falling into place. The years I had spent seeking tranquility, trying to let the rigid discipline of my former life fall away, had just been put on hold. A familiar sense of purpose, a feeling I hadn't experienced since I'd taken off my uniform for the last time, descended upon me. It was the calm that comes before a complex operation, the quiet focus of a commander assessing a hostile theater. Brenda saw my silence as submission. She gave a curt, satisfied nod. Good. I'm glad we understand each other. She turned and marched back toward the sidewalk, her back ramrod straight. Oh, we understood each other perfectly. She had just declared war on my peace. She had trespassed on my sanctuary and tried to burn it down with her petty regulations. She had mistaken a sleeping lion for a house cat. And I, in turn, had just accepted a new mission. The objective? The complete and systematic dismantling of her little empire. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you have ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA board member who thinks their little binder of rules somehow supersedes state law, property rights, and common sense, then you are going to want to stick around for this one. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because you're not going to want to miss how this plays out. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what your own HOA nightmare story is. It's always good to know you're not alone in the fight. Now, let me tell you how this all started. After 3 decades of moving every 2 or 3 years, of living in concrete boxes on military bases from Germany to Korea, all my wife and I wanted was a piece of land with character. We weren't looking for a house. We were looking for a sanctuary. I'd spent my career imposing order on chaos, building bridges, dams, airfields, often in places that were actively trying to resist the effort. I was done with straight lines and right angles. I wanted curves, slopes, and the beautiful, unpredictable logic of nature. We found it on the edge of a new, upscale development called the Estates at Whispering Creek. It was a 5-acre rectangle of old-growth forest that had been the original homestead for the farm the development was built on. The property was a carve-out, a piece the developer couldn't easily build on due to the topography and the federally protected stream, the titular Whispering Creek, that formed its back border. It was perfect. The house was a sturdy, century-old farmhouse, renovated but not stripped of its soul. But the real prize was the land itself. A thick stand of hardwoods, a deer trail that meandered through the ferns, and at the bottom of a gentle slope, the springhouse. It was a small, beautifully constructed stone building, cool and damp inside, with a trough of crystal-clear water bubbling up from the earth and trickling out to join the creek. The easement in question was the original path from the farmhouse to the springhouse. It was just wide enough for a small cart, and the stones lining it were worn smooth by time. During the purchase, I was meticulous. My lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman who specialized in rural property law, went over every document with a microscope. We confirmed it 3 times. My 5 acres were explicitly, legally, and irrevocably excluded from the HOA that governed the surrounding development. The plat maps were unambiguous. The deed was ironclad. I owned my land, free and clear of any covenants, conditions, or restrictions from the estates at Whispering Creek. I was an island of autonomy in a sea of beige uniformity. For 2 years, it was exactly the paradise we had imagined. I spent my days clearing invasive species, maintaining the trail, and just sitting by the creek, letting the silence wash over me. I was a man at peace. I'd nod to my neighbors, the residents of the HOA, but kept a polite distance. I had no interest in their landscaping committee meetings or their disputes over the approved shade of front door paint. My first real interaction with Brenda was about 6 months in. She appeared at my door with a welcome basket and a 3-inch thick binder. The basket contained a single, dry muffin and a bottle of branded water. The binder contained the HOA covenants. "Just so you're aware of the community standards," she'd said, her smile like a freshly sharpened knife. "Thank you for the muffin, Brenda," I'd replied, handing the binder back to her. "But my property isn't in the HOA." The smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Well, yes, technically, but we're all part of the same community. We find it's best when everyone adheres to the same guidelines. It protects property values. My property value is protected by the 5 acres of pristine woodland and a federally protected stream it sits on, I said, perhaps a bit too curtly, not by a rule dictating the maximum height of my mailbox. That was my first mistake. I had not just corrected her, I had dismissed her authority. For a person like Brenda, that was an unforgivable sin. The war had likely been declared, in her mind, right then and there. I just hadn't realized I was a combatant yet. Her campaign started small. Passive-aggressive notes left on my door about the length of my grass near the road, even though my property line was a good 20 feet back from the curb. Complaints about the unsightly bird feeders I had hung from an oak tree in my front yard. Each time I would politely, and in writing, remind her of the property boundaries and my non-membership in her association. The confrontation over the springhouse path was the official declaration of hostilities. She had finally found something she believed gave her leverage, a supposed rule about pathways visible from common areas. The path was, if you stood at the very end of the cul-de-sac and craned your neck, technically visible for about 30 feet. It was a laughable pretext, but it was the pretext she was going with. She had escalated from nuisance to a direct threat against the integrity of my land. And that, I decided as I watched her march away, was an escalation I was uniquely equipped to counter. The peaceful retiree was on leave. Colonel Jack Sterling of the Army Corps of Engineers was back on duty. The first official salvo from her side arrived a week later. It wasn't a note on my door. It was a formal letter delivered by the mailman. The envelope was made of a heavy, cream-colored cardstock, the kind of thing you use for wedding invitations. In the top left corner, an embossed logo in gold foil. The Estates at Whispering Creek, HOA, Preserving Excellence. It was so absurdly pompous I almost laughed. The letter inside was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive corporate speak. It referenced our recent conversation and formally notified me of a violation of Covenant 7B4. It detailed the unapproved natural surface pathway and its failure to meet community aesthetic and safety standards. It informed me that a fine of $100 had been assessed to my address, and that the fine would accrue daily until the violation is remediated. Instead of anger, I felt a surge of cold, methodical energy. This was her opening move, and it was clumsy. It was based on a false premise, her jurisdiction, and documented her intent. It was perfect. I went down to my office in the basement. It was my sanctuary, a room lined with bookshelves holding everything from military history to manuals on geological surveys. I cleared the center of my large oak desk. I went to the supply closet and pulled out a brand new 3-inch D-ring binder. It was a heavy-duty one, black, with a clear plastic sleeve on the front. On my computer, I designed a cover page. In a simple, bold, military-style font, I typed the title, Operation Spring Freedom. Below that, a subtitle, Documentation and Countermeasures Regarding HOA Overreach. I printed it and slid it into the cover. The weight of the binder in my hands felt good. It felt familiar. The first document I placed inside was Brenda's letter. I 3-hole punched it carefully, reinforcing the holes so they wouldn't tear. I then created my first tab, labeled Incoming Correspondence. Behind a second tab, Legal and Surveys, I placed a pristine copy of my property deed, the official county plat map highlighting my boundaries, and a notarized document from my closing attorney explicitly stating my property's exclusion from the HOA. The third tab was Outgoing Correspondence. It was currently empty, but it wouldn't be for long. My response had to be precise, not emotional, not angry. It had to be a legal instrument, a shot across the bow designed to show her she was engaging a prepared and competent adversary. I spent 2 hours drafting it. Dear Mr. Brenda, it began, using the formal title as a subtle jab at her self-importance. This letter is in response to your correspondence dated date, which I received on date. Please be advised that the property located at my address is not and has never been subject to the covenants, conditions, or restrictions of the estates at Whispering Creek Homeowners Association. I went on. For your reference, I have attached a copy of the official county plat map with my property boundaries clearly demarcated. As you can plainly see, my parcel is a legal carve-out and falls entirely outside of the HOA's jurisdiction. Consequently, any attempt to enforce your association's bylaws, including the levying of fines or the placing of liens against my property, constitutes illegal harassment and tortious interference with my property rights. I then address the specific demand. Furthermore, regarding the easement path to my springhouse, your demand that it be paved is not only legally baseless, but environmentally reckless. As a retired colonel with the United States Army Corps of Engineers, with extensive experience in civil engineering and hydrology, I can state with professional certainty that your proposal would cause irreversible damage to the local watershed. I have a legal and moral obligation to be a steward of this land, which includes protecting the spring and the creek it feeds. I will not be violating that stewardship to satisfy an arbitrary and destructive aesthetic preference. I finished with a clear, firm line. Please cease and desist all further attempts to assert authority over my property. Any further correspondence on this matter will be forwarded to my legal counsel. All future communication must be in writing. I printed the letter on my own quality bond paper. I made a copy for my binder. I attached copies of the plat map and the legal statement from my attorney. Then I drove to the post office. I sent it via certified mail with return receipt requested. This was critical. It created a legal record that she had received and signed for my communication. There could be no plausible deniability. The little green return receipt card came back a few days later, bearing Brenda's spiky, imperious signature. I smiled, three-hole punched it, and filed it behind the copy of my letter in the binder. The machine was humming now. The process was in motion. I honestly thought that might be the end of it. I had presented incontrovertible evidence. I had stated my position clearly and professionally. I had warned of legal consequences. A rational person would have recognized their error, perhaps consulted their own lawyer, and retreated. Brenda, I was learning, was not a rational person. She was a creature of pure ego. My response, with its facts and legal citations, was not seen as a correction, but as a challenge to her authority, and she could not abide a challenge. Her reply arrived 2 weeks later, also via certified mail. She was learning, but not the right lessons. The tone of this letter was different. The faux pleasantries were gone, replaced by a brittle, hectoring condescension. Your refusal to cooperate is duly noted, it began. Your self-proclaimed expertise is irrelevant. The Covenants Committee has reviewed the matter and has determined that the visibility of the blighted pathway from the community common area grants the association aesthetic oversight. Your plat maps are secondary to the lived experience and visual harmony of the neighborhood. Lived experience and visual harmony. It was the kind of meaningless jargon a petty tyrant uses to justify their overreach. She was rejecting objective legal reality in favor of her subjective feelings. Your fines have now accrued to $1,400, the letter continued. Furthermore, the board has voted to double the daily fine to $200, effective immediately, due to your continued and willful non-compliance. You have 10 business days to remit payment and provide the board with a remediation plan for the pathway. Failure to do so will result in the immediate placement of a lien against your property. I read the letter twice, a slow smile spreading across my face. It was magnificent. It was a signed confession of her intent to commit an illegal act, filing a fraudulent lien. She had ignored the evidence. She had rejected the legal warning. She had doubled down on her losing position. I punched the letter and the new green receipt card, filing them neatly in the binder. The incoming correspondence section was getting thicker. My case was getting stronger. She was building it for me, one arrogant, ill-advised letter at a time. The time for reactive measures was over. It was time to go on the offensive. Operation Spring Freedom was entering Phase 2, reconnaissance and alliance building. My first stop was the county records office. I spent a full day there, pulling not only my own deed and survey records, but the master plans and incorporation documents for the estates at Whispering Creek, HOA. I wanted to understand their legal foundation, their declared boundaries, their own rules of incorporation. I paid for certified copies of everything. The clerks, initially bored, became quite helpful when they understood what I was doing. It seems Brenda had a reputation that extended beyond the neighborhood. Then I moved on to state law. My focus was on environmental protections. I spent hours in the online archives of the state's Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP. I searched for statutes related to natural springs, groundwater, and protected watersheds. And then I found it. It was a state statute passed about a decade earlier designed to protect historic rural water sources. It was titled the Heritage Waters Act. The language was clear and direct. Any naturally occurring spring that had been in continuous use for 50 years or more and its historical access route was granted special protected status. Any action that would impede, contaminate, or otherwise degrade such a source was strictly prohibited. The penalties were severe, fines of up to $10,000 per day and potential criminal charges for willful violation. My springhouse was over a century old. The easement was its historical access route. Brenda wasn't just asking me to do something stupid, she was demanding I commit a crime. Her plan to pave the easement wasn't just a violation of my property rights, it was a flagrant violation of state environmental law. This was more than a smoking gun. This was a tactical nuke. I printed out the entire text of the Heritage Waters Act, highlighted the relevant sections, and added it to a new tab in my binder, Superseding Law. The next morning, I called the regional office of the DEP. I explained the situation to a compliance officer named David. I expected bureaucratic indifference. What I got was quiet, simmering outrage. "Let me get this straight, Colonel," he said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Your HOA is ordering you to pave over a century-old spring easement, an active, natural spring." "That's correct," I said. "They are threatening to fine me, lien my property, and hire a contractor to do it if I refuse." There was a moment of silence on the line, followed by a heavy sigh. "Sir, I deal with corporate polluters and illegal dumping. I thought I'd heard it all. This is a new level of arrogant ignorance." He paused. "On behalf of the state, thank you for not complying. You would be in serious legal jeopardy if you did. The HOA would be as well, of course, but they'd undoubtedly try to claim you were the responsible party." I told him about my documentation. He was impressed. "Colonel, you've done everything right," he said. "Email me copies of your correspondence and the relevant property records. I'm opening a formal case file right now. We will be sending a notification letter to the HOA president. It will be strongly worded." I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. I had now engaged a higher authority. This was no longer just me versus Brenda. It was Brenda versus the state. She was fighting a war on two fronts and didn't even know it yet. The next phase was ground-level intelligence. I needed to know if I was the only one in her crosshairs. I started taking walks through the neighborhood in the evenings, a time when people are out watering their lawns or walking their dogs. I was no longer the aloof recluse. I was on a reconnaissance mission. My first contact was a woman named Margaret, who was meticulously tending a bed of prize-winning roses. I complimented them, and it was like opening a floodgate. It turned out Brenda and her aesthetic committee had cited her 3 times. Her roses were a non-approved cultivar. The organic fertilizer she used had a disagreeable odor. The small, tasteful sign that identified the rose variety was unauthorized signage. She told me I had to replace them with the approved knockout roses you see everywhere else, Margaret said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. These were my mother's. I've been cultivating this strain for 20 years. I listened patiently. I told her a little about my own struggle with the pathway. Her eyes widened. She's insane, she whispered, but she has the whole board wrapped around her finger. No one dares to stand up to her. Maybe that's about to change, I said quietly. Over the next week, I collected more stories. The Millers, a young family with 2 small children, were being fined weekly because their kid's plastic slide was visible from the street. They were supposed to store it in the garage every single night. Mr. Henderson, a quiet widower in his 80s, was cited because the paint on his trim was peeling slightly. He lived on a fixed income and couldn't afford to have the whole house repainted. The pattern was clear. Brenda's enforcement was arbitrary, cruel, and targeted those she perceived as either unable or unwilling to fight back. She was a bully, plain and simple, ruling by fear and intimidation. The community she claimed to be preserving was actually being suffocated. I took detailed notes after each conversation, dating them and summarizing the grievances. This went into a new section of the binder, Allied Forces, Witness Statements. My little resistance cell was growing. People started talking to each other, realizing they weren't alone. A current of dissent was beginning to flow beneath the placid surface of the estates at Whispering Creek. The final piece of the puzzle fell into my lap unexpectedly. I received an anonymous email. "I heard you're fighting Brenda," it read. "I used to be on the board. I quit when I saw what was happening. Check the budget for common area landscaping enhancements. She's using the general fund as her personal slush fund for pet projects and legal threats. She doesn't get board approval, she just does it. Attached are the last 6 months of financials. Good luck." I opened the attachment. It was a set of spreadsheets, and there it was, under a line item from 3 months prior, legal consultation, property dispute for $500. She was using their money to pay a lawyer to threaten me. And there were other suspicious entries, exorbitant charges for committee meeting supplies, administrative printing, and thousands spent on landscaping projects that were never voted on. This was the kill shot. It was one thing to be a bully, it was another to be a financially irresponsible one, possibly even an embezzler. Her power was derived from the residents' belief that she was working in their best interest. This proved she was working only in her own. I printed everything and added it to the binder. It was now almost 4 inches thick. It was a dense, heavy weapon, loaded with facts, laws, and testimony. Operation Spring Freedom was ready to enter its final phase, the counter-offensive. The first step was to bring in air support. I called my old friend Marcus, a retired JAG colonel who now ran a private practice specializing in property and contract law. We had served together at Fort Leonard Wood, and I knew him to be as sharp and tenacious as a hungry badger. "Jack, my friend," he boomed over the phone, "don't tell me you finally decided to build a moat and declare your farm a sovereign nation. I've been waiting for this call." "Something like that, Marcus," I chuckled. "I'm emailing you a PDF. It's a bit large. Let me know when you've had a chance to look it over." I sent him the scanned contents of the entire binder. I called it op_spring_freedom_briefing_book.pdf. He called me back 2 hours later. The jovial tone was gone. His voice was clipped, professional, and filled with a kind of predatory glee that I knew meant he smelled blood in the water. "Jack," he said slowly, "this isn't a briefing book. This is a prosecutor's dream. It's a kill box. You've documented every step. You've established a pattern of harassment. You've cited superseding state law, and you have evidence of potential financial malfeasance. This woman is a walking, talking lawsuit. So you'll take the case? Take the case, he laughed, a short, sharp bark. Jack, I'm going to frame this binder. My retainer is $1. The rest of my fee will be paid by her, either from the HOA's insurance or from her personal assets when we countersue for harassment and filing a fraudulent lien. Draft a letter for me. We're about to introduce Mr. Brenda to a level of legal firepower she has only seen on television. We drafted a letter from his office. It was a thing of beauty, cold, precise, and utterly menacing. It cited the specific state and county laws Brenda was violating, referenced the Heritage Waters Act by statute number, and included the case file number from the Department of Environmental Protection. It demanded the immediate withdrawal of all fines, a written apology, and a formal cessation of all contact. It concluded by stating that any attempt to place a lien on my property would be met with a lawsuit for damages, legal fees, and punitive sanctions for filing a fraudulent legal instrument. We sent it from his office, again via certified mail. This, I thought, would surely be the end. She was now facing not just me, but a state agency and a very aggressive lawyer. No sane person would continue. But her ego was a force of nature, a hurricane of irrationality that could not be deterred by mere facts or legal threats. She was so convinced of her own righteousness that she made her final, critical error. She escalated from paper threats to direct physical action. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I was in my workshop, restoring an old piece of furniture, when I heard the unmistakable rumble of a heavy truck and the high-pitched of a vehicle in reverse. I walked out my front door and my blood ran cold. A large dump truck was backing down my street, and a crew of men in bright yellow vests were unloading equipment. A paving machine sat on a flatbed trailer. They were staging at the end of the cul-de-sac, right next to the head of my easement path. Brenda was there, pointing and directing traffic like a pint-sized paten. She saw me and gave a triumphant, smug little wave. She had ignored my lawyer. She had ignored the DEP. She had called my bluff. She was actually going to do it. I didn't shout. I didn't run. I walked calmly back into my house. I retrieved 2 items, my smartphone and the binder. I started recording video before I even stepped back outside. I walked calmly down my lawn to where the crew foreman was looking at a work order. Brenda stood beside him, a smirk plastered on her face. "Good morning," I said, my voice even. I made sure the phone's camera was capturing both of them clearly. "May I ask what you're doing?" "Paving this path, buddy," the foreman said, not looking up from his clipboard. "Got a work order right here from the HOA. "You see," Brenda chirped, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. "We told you we would have the work done. This is your last chance to cooperate. If you pay the accrued fines now, we'll only bill you for the cost of the paving. If not, you'll get the bill for everything." "Foreman," I said, ignoring her completely, my eyes locked on the man in charge. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are currently on the verge of committing criminal trespass and destruction of private property." He finally looked up, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Look, pal, I just do what the work order says." "This is my property," I said, my voice dropping to a lower, more serious register. "It is not part of the HOA. You and your men are about to operate heavy machinery on private land without the owner's permission. That owner is me." I opened the binder to the plat map. I held it up for him to see. "This is the official county survey. As you can see, this path is entirely within my property lines." I then flipped to the letter from the Department of Environmental Protection. "Furthermore, this path is a protected historical easement to a natural spring. Paving it is a violation of the State Heritage Waters Act." This is a letter from the DEP confirming that fact. Committing this act will open your company up to massive fines from the state. The foreman's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. He took the binder from me and looked at the documents. Brenda started to sputter. "He's lying. He's just trying to intimidate you. The HOA has indemnified your work," she shrieked. "Ma'am, please be quiet," the foreman said, his eyes scanning the DEP letter. He looked at me, then at his feet, then back at me. He saw the phone in my hand, the red light indicating it was recording. "Is this for real?" he asked me, his voice now hushed. "Absolutely real," I confirmed. "And this entire conversation, including her ordering you to break the law, is being recorded. My attorney has already been notified. If one piece of your equipment touches my land, we will not only sue your company into bankruptcy, but we will pursue criminal charges against you personally for willful destruction of a protected environmental site." He paled. He handed the binder back to me as if it were radioactive. "All right, that's it. Pack it up, boys," he yelled to his crew. "We're out of here. Job's canceled." The crew, who had been watching the exchange with interest, immediately started packing up their tools. Brenda went nuclear. "What are you doing? You can't leave. I have a contract. I will sue you," she screeched, her face turning a mottled shade of crimson. The foreman turned to face her, his face a mask of cold fury. "Lady, you tried to get me and my men to commit a felony. You lied on the work order. My contract has a clause about the client providing legal and uncontested access to the worksite. You failed to do that. You can talk to my company's lawyer." He jabbed a thumb toward me. "My advice? You better get a damn good lawyer of your own. You're gonna need it." He climbed into the cab of his truck, and his crew followed suit. Within 10 minutes, they were gone. It was just me and Brenda, standing in the silence. Her face was a grotesque mixture of rage, shock, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine fear. She had wielded her power for so long, she had no idea what to do when it so completely and publicly failed her. You will regret this," she hissed, her voice a raw whisper. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, holding the binder, my phone still recording, as she turned and practically fled, her smug composure utterly shattered. The video of the confrontation was the spark that lit the fire. I sent a copy to Marcus, who cackled with delight. Then I edited a shorter version and emailed it to Margaret, the Millers, and the other neighbors who had shared their stories with me. The effect was instantaneous. Their fear, which had kept them silent for so long, was burned away by a hot surge of outrage. Seeing Brenda so thoroughly defeated, her authority crumbling in the face of simple facts, was galvanizing. The resistance cell became a rebel alliance. An emergency HOA meeting was called. The official reason, posted on the community bulletin board, was to discuss unforeseen landscaping expenditures. The real reason, we all knew, was that Brenda needed to control the narrative. She was going to try and spin her public humiliation into a story of my villainy and her brave defense of the community. We were ready for her. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. It was usually a sparse affair, attended only by Brenda, her two sycophantic board members, a meek man named Gerald, and a sharp-faced woman named Carol, and a handful of retirees. Tonight, nearly 80 residents were crammed into the small room. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Marcus came as my guest. He sat in the back, a briefcase on his lap, looking more like a predator observing a herd of deer than a lawyer at a community meeting. Brenda, flanked by her cronies, sat at a folding table at the front of the room. She looked pale and strained, but she had put on her armor of self-righteousness. She banged the gavel with more force than necessary. "This emergency meeting of the estates at Whispering Creek HOA will now come to order," she announced, her voice tight. She launched into a prepared speech, a rambling, self-pitying narrative about a hostile, non-member resident who was aggressively threatening the safety and aesthetic harmony of our community. She painted my defense of my own property as an attack on all of them. She spoke of the paving project as a necessary safety upgrade that had been maliciously sabotaged. When she was finished, a smattering of polite, uncertain applause came from the front row. She then made her next mistake. "Are there any questions?" she asked, clearly expecting none. I stood up. A hush fell over the room. "I don't have a question, Brenda," I said, my voice carrying easily in the silent room. "I have a presentation." Before she could object, Mr. Henderson, the quiet widower, stood up. "I make a motion to cede 5 minutes of my speaking time to my neighbor, Colonel Sterling." Margaret immediately stood. "I second the motion." Brenda looked stunned. That's not proper procedure." "The bylaws state any member can cede their time to another resident, member or not, with a second," Mr. Henderson said, his voice surprisingly firm. He had done his homework. "All in favor?" A deafening roar of "Aye" filled the room. Brenda's gavel was useless against it. She sank back in her chair, her face ashen. I walked to the front of the room, where a projector had been set up for Brenda's presentation. I connected my laptop. The first image that appeared on the screen was the cover of my binder. Operation Spring Freedom. For the next 5 minutes, I laid out the case with military precision. I showed them the plat map, clearly delineating my property. I showed them the timeline of her letters, the escalating fines, the illegal threats. I put up the text of the Heritage Waters Act on the screen, highlighting the penalties for its violation. "The president of your association," I said, my voice calm and factual, "did not just harass a private citizen. She used your funds to demand that I commit an act that would have exposed me and this entire association to tens of thousands of dollars in state fines and potential criminal liability." I then played the video of the standoff with the paving crew. The room was utterly silent as they watched Brenda's tirade, her public unraveling. When it ended, there was a wave of angry murmuring. My time was up. I sat down. Then Margaret stood up. She spoke with a trembling but clear voice about the harassment over her mother's roses, holding up photos of the citation letters. Then the Millers stood up, talking about the constant fines over their children's toys and the stress it had placed on their family. Then Mr. Henderson stood, his voice cracking with emotion, and described the humiliation of being threatened with a lien over a bit of peeling paint he couldn't afford to fix. One by one, a dozen residents stood and shared their stories of petty tyranny, of arbitrary fines, of a community ruled by fear. The final blow came from Sarah, the former board member. She stood up from the back of the room. "I can no longer stay silent," she said. "Brenda has been mismanaging our funds for years." I clicked the remote, and the financial spreadsheet I'd been sent appeared on the screen, projected 10 feet high for all to see. Sarah walked them through it, line by line. The $500 for a lawyer to threaten me. The $3,000 for the paving company's mobilization fee, which the HOA now had to forfeit. The thousands more in vaguely described administrative costs. The room exploded. The murmuring became a roar of outrage. People were on their feet, shouting questions, pointing at Brenda. She lost what little composure she had left. "Lies! These are all lies! You are all out of order!" she shrieked, banging her gavel over and over. Bang, bang, bang. But the sound was pathetic, a child's toy against a tidal wave of populist fury. Her power, built on a foundation of bluff and intimidation, had completely evaporated. Mr. Henderson, now looking 10 feet tall, climbed onto a chair. "I make a motion for a vote of no confidence in President Brenda Smith and the entire current board." "Seconded," shouted a dozen voices at once. "All in favor of removing the board say, aye." The resulting sound was not a vote. It was a primal scream of liberation. It was a physical force that shook the room. All opposed? Silence. Utter, complete silence. Not even Gerald and Carol, her cronies, dared to speak. "The motion carries," Mr. Henderson declared into the stunned quiet. Brenda stared out at the sea of hostile faces, her mouth agape. She had been the queen, and her subjects had just stormed the castle. Stripped of her title, her authority, her entire identity, she looked small and pathetic. She grabbed her purse, stumbled from the table, and fled the room, pushing through the crowd to the exit. No one made way for her. No one said a word. They just watched her go. The aftermath was swift and decisive. An interim board was elected on the spot, with a reluctant but determined Sarah at its head and Mr. Henderson as the new treasurer. Their first official act was to unanimously pass a motion to void every fine levied by Brenda over the past 2 years. A wave of audible relief swept through the room. Their second act was to draft a formal letter of apology to me and the other residents who had been targeted. But that was just the beginning of the reckoning for Brenda. Marcus, my lawyer, filed a civil suit against her personally the very next day. We sued for harassment, attempted fraudulent lien, and attorney's fees. The new HOA board, after a full audit revealed the depth of her financial mismanagement, filed their own suit against her to recoup the misspent funds, including the forfeited paving contract deposit and the legal fees they now had to pay to defend against my suit. The Department of Environmental Protection completed their investigation and fined her personally, not the HOA, $5,000 for attempting to violate the Heritage Waters Act. The story was picked up by the local news, a salacious little piece about a power-mad HOA president brought down by her own community. The public humiliation was absolute. Buried under a mountain of legal fees and judgments, Brenda was forced to sell her home. The last I saw of her, she was supervising a moving truck, her face a tight, bitter mask. She didn't look at anyone. She just got in her car and drove away from the community she had tried so hard to control, leaving it in peace at last. The change in the neighborhood was palpable. The oppressive atmosphere of fear lifted like a fog. People started talking to each other again. Kids' toys reappeared on lawns. Margaret's roses flourished, winning a regional award that spring. The Millers hosted a neighborhood barbecue. Mr. Henderson, now a respected community elder, got his trim painted by a group of volunteers. The estates at Whispering Creek finally started to feel like a community. The new board, with my input, hired a responsible contractor to remediate the easement. They didn't pave it. Instead, they carefully graded the path, laid down a permeable layer of fine gravel, and planted native, water-loving ferns and flowers along its edges. They stabilized the slope and reinforced the stone borders. It was beautiful, functional, and environmentally sound. The HOA paid for it all, a gesture of goodwill that formally and finally ended the war. I am sitting by the springhouse now, a glass of cool water drawn from the source in my hand. The late afternoon sun filters through the canopy of the old oaks, dappling the path in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The sound of the bubbling spring is the only thing that breaks the silence, a quiet, constant murmur of life. It's peaceful here. It is the sanctuary I sought, the tranquility I fought to protect. There's a lesson in all of this, I suppose. It's about the nature of peace. Peace is not a passive state. It is not simply the absence of conflict. Sometimes, peace is a fortress that must be actively, methodically, and relentlessly defended from the petty tyrants who would tear it down. True peace, the kind that lasts, isn't given, it is earned.